Welcome on the Gospel Spice podcast, where you are invited to taste and see that the Lord is good. Gospel Spice is your Christ-centered podcast, infused with in-depth biblical flavors and sprinkled with a dash of French culture, guaranteed to spice up your relationship with God. I'm your host, Stephanie Rousselle, and here is today's episode. So, Professor Pearcey, welcome on the Gospel Spice podcast.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
I have been looking forward to this conversation probably upwards of 2 years at the very least. That's a long time. Our family discovered you through your book, Saving Leonardo, way back when, right? This was what, 2010, 2013? All right. Tell us about it briefly. What is the book all about? Very quickly, before we jump into more of a conversation about your latest book that we're discussing today.
Yes, I'm glad you asked because you and I have some background in common with L'Abri, with the work of Francis Schaefer. And Francis Schaefer...
Well, I don't have any personal experience. I certainly wish I did, but I'm fascinated with what took place there. So tell us more. Yes.
Well, the term cultural apologetics was coined to describe what Schaefer did, because he didn't just go through logical arguments, which is so much of what apologetics is, but he looked at ideas as they percolate down through cultural forms like art, literature, music, even movies and advertisements. And so people coined the term cultural apologetics. And by the way, that is what I teach now at Houston Christian University. It is cultural apologetics. But so I really wanted myself to dig into the same kind of method. Having become a Christian at L'Abri, I was always looking for how to go deeper, how to take what I learned at L'Abri, go deeper, reapply it, see how these same concepts and arguments apply today. And so Saving Leonardo was my chance to look at ideas as they are expressed through the arts. And so the whole book, it's almost an intro to philosophy and an intro to art history at the same time, because you get, here are the basic ideas that have driven Western culture, and here are the ways those ideas were expressed through various art movements. You know, each art movement was actually an expression of a different philosophy. And you really understand the art better if you know the philosophy. So my art students like it because they feel like they got a better understanding of art. It's not just, painting pretty pictures. And the philosophy or, other students like it because they never realized art had so much intellectual content, that the artists were really working with ideas. It's just that they were using the language of art. They were using a visual language to express those ideas, but it was still, they were wrestling with the same ideas as the rest of their culture at the time. So it's a really fun book to teach. I have my students do a timeline. People ask me, why didn't you put a timeline in there? Because I want my students to do it. That's why. They learn so much more that way. And when they put all the philosophers, all the artists, composers, poets, novelists, theologians as well, scientists, by the way, as well, because science influences the modern worldview so much. And they come back and tell me, I use this timeline in all my other classes now, because it gives me a way to say, oh, what's this person's context? Where does he fit in this timeline? So they take it into the other classes as well. Mm-hmm. It's used a lot by homeschooling students also because of that.
Oh, and I think it's so precious because having received kind of a classical French education, which was a mix of arts, history, philosophy, it kind of coalesced all of that within a Christian worldview. And growing up, I didn't have the Christian worldview. So it kind of put a lot of pieces together into place for me. And then this is something we really enjoy going over with our kids as well, because it was, again, fundamental in teaching all of those elements from the Christian perspective, the Christian worldview. So thank you so much. That's how our family discovered you. And we've been hooked ever since. So tell us a little bit, maybe before we dig into the book we're discussing today, The Toxic War on Masculinity. Before we get there, tell us about you a little bit, Nancy. You mentioned Europe. I love you for it, and so many other reasons. So tell us more.
Yes. Well, I'll try to mix in my testimony as well. I was raised in a Christian home, but it was a Lutheran home. It was very Scandinavian. My grandparents came over from Scandinavia. So my mom's pure Norwegian, my dad's pure Swedish. It was still kind of an immigrant home, by the way, the ethos. But what the problem with ethnic religions is that they rely a lot on the ethnicity to hold you. there's not a lot of personal commitment. In high school, about halfway through high school, I started asking questions about my faith. How do we know it's true? I mean, that was the basic one. How do we know it's true? Because I'm going to a public high school, all my textbooks are secular, all my teachers are secular. And I just wanted to know, how can we be confident that Christianity is true? And my parents' response was sort of like, well, we're Swedish, what else are you going to be? Or one person put it this way. I said, why are you a Christian? And he was a Christian university professor. And yet all he said was, works for me. That's it. And I had a chance to talk to a seminary dean, and all he said was, don't worry, we all have doubts sometimes. So I just wasn't getting any answers at all.
And actually, it's fascinating because what you just nailed were kind of two generational responses to the questions of faith. First is it true? Which is not a question our generation is asking so much anymore. Now the generation is asking the question more of, does it work for me? Is it convenient? Does it fill my needs? Can I be served by this worldview? And if so, I'm going to adopt it. If not, I'm going to toss it. And it's not so much what is true, right? Which was still the case when you and I were a bit younger, maybe. So I'm sorry. Yeah.
No, that's a good point. I often introduce my other book, my latest book, Love Thy Body. I often introduce it that way. I say people are no longer asking, is Christianity true? They're asking, why are Christians such bigots? So in that book, I deal with questions like homosexuality, transgenderism, and abortion, and so on, because you have to show that Christianity is appealing. You have to show that it has a high view of the human person, of human value and dignity. And so my earlier book, I did address that question, because you're absolutely right. The questions have changed. I ended up, to pick up the story again, I became very, very secular in my thinking. I realized pretty quickly if there was no God, when I started asking questions in high school, if there's no God, there's no purpose to life. There's no meaning to life. We're just on a rock flying through empty space. There's no foundation for ethics. It's just, like you just said, what works for me, what doesn't work for you. And I even realized there's no basis for knowledge, because if all I've had is my puny brain and the vast scope of time and history, what makes me think I could have any sort of universal absolute truth? Ridiculous. And that's how I thought of it at the time. Ridiculous. Of course you can't know truth. So but by the time I went to college, I was already very much of a relativist, skeptic, determinist. From my science classes, I picked up that we were just complex biochemical machines anyway. So and it was when I went back to Europe, as you mentioned. I had lived in Europe as a child, and I saved up my money all through high school so I could go back. I played the violin in the El Paso Symphony Orchestra, and that's how I saved up all my money, went back to Europe, went back to Germany. And it was through that through circumstances, a long story, I ended up at L'Abri in Switzerland. And it was through Schaefer's cultural apologetics approach that I was eventually persuaded that Christianity really is true. It took a year and a half. I left L'Abri once, became a Christian strictly on my own, and then came back. So it was a year and a half process. But it was through the cultural apologetics, that I became a Christian. I was not interested in the other forms of apologetics. I think it's the only way I would have been persuaded, because perhaps because of my musical background. The other forms of apologetics just didn't touch me. And that's why all my writing since then has focused on cultural apologetics, writing on different topics and how to show that Christianity is true, and address the questions that young people have today. I feel such an empathy with them because I went through that myself. So I want to be able to have answers for young people today.
And young people and their parents and everyone in between, we all need to be educated and informed. And we live in a generation that is so bombarded by so many different cultures and worldviews that we really need more than ever, I would say. I mean, I guess every generation has had to. We all say, more than ever, but it's true. I mean, we are confronted with the entire worldviews of the entire world, and that is unique to our generation today. That creates unique challenges. So do you want to tell us a little bit what led you to write maybe briefly Saving Leonardo, Total Truth, Love Thy Body, and now the Toxic War on Masculinity, just briefly through these issues before, again, I want us to zone in on the Toxic War on Masculinity for sure, but it's one tome among, I think, an entire journey that your entire curriculum takes us through as readers to address all of those issues. These are all pieces of a puzzle. So Love Thy Body, you've mentioned it briefly. Total Truth, tell us briefly what that's about, maybe.
Yeah, I'll go backwards because a lot of people today are saying, when I'm on these interviews, people say, "Oh, this book, Love Thy Body, and your current book, Toxic War and Masculinity, form sort of a unit. They go together." And a lot of people are saying you need to read them together. Love Thy Body deals with transgenderism and all those gender issues, and then of course Toxic Masculinity deals with masculinity. And before that, yes, we mentioned Saving Leonardo, which it's still my favorite. It's my own favorite.
Is it? Oh my goodness, I didn't know that. I have a soft spot for it because it was our first one with you, but I can't say it's my favorite, but it does have a special place in my heart.
What I love about it is it engages ideas and the arts, the cognitive and the creative. And so it addresses the whole person.
Yes, yes. And I have such a, I don't know if it's the French or the European upbringing, but I have such a sensitivity to beauty. And I am so convinced that beauty is such a powerful apologetics that, addressing that is so important and often overlooked in Christian circles, sadly.
Yes. Yes. The ancients talked about truth, goodness, and beauty. We like truth and goodness, but we often skip beauty.
Yes. And beauty in all of the five senses, Gospel Spice, our motto is taste and see that the Lord is good. And so I think it's beauty in all its forms, not just visual beauty. Art is through the five senses. Mm-hmm.
Yes, and you should get it on Kindle, by the way, because then you get the backlighting to all the images. It's full of, I guess we didn't say this, but unlike some art books, it's actually full of images. It's got lots of examples in full color. And so it was really fun working on it because every time I brought up my manuscript to work on it, I got to see these beautiful images, So before that, I think that one before that was Finding Truth. Have you read this one? If you haven't, I think you in particular would like it.
I have not. I've read Total Truth, not Finding Truth. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's the one that's the most purely apologetic because all the others I'm dealing with apologetics and masculinity, apologetics and the sexuality issues, apologetics and art. And this one is purely apologetics. And what it does is it takes Romans 1. It takes Romans 1 and unpacks it and shows that Romans gives us the tools for an apologetic that, in a sense, incorporates all the best of all the man-made systems. Apologetics, it's still man-made systems out there. And I myself even found my own faith strengthened by writing this book because it draws out an apologetic that's based in scripture. And so, of course, it's reliable, and you don't have to think, well, even I became a Christian through Labrie. Yeah, but that was Schaefer's arguments, or I teach now at Houston Christian where we have one of our apologists is the very well-known William Lane Craig. Okay, but those are his arguments. And in Finding Truth, I pull out Paul's arguments in Romans 1 and show that it has many, many dimensions that we don't usually recognize. And it gives us the tools to handle any ism. If you become a Christian through apologetics, you want to stay open-minded. Like, well, maybe someday I'll find an argument I can't handle, an objection that I can't respond to. After writing Finding Truth, I now know that I will never encounter something I cannot respond to. That Romans 1 gives the tools to handle any ism, religious or secular. Any ism, you'll be equipped to handle. So it's especially good for young people because they don't have to memorize every argument. When I came home from Labrie, I felt like, okay, now I have to memorize every ism out there and all the arguments against them. And I realized, this is going to take a lifetime. With this tool, you don't have to memorize all the different isms. You master one strategy, and it will apply to all the isms out there.
Okay, well, next on my reading list, Finding Truth.
So you can see I'm enthusiastic about that one. This one, Yeah, I have my books behind me. So total truth, total truth. Professor Schaefer, I think one of his most important messages, perhaps the most important message, was what you keyed in on earlier. The concept of truth itself has changed. The people are no longer asking what is true. And he explains why that is, that the concept of truth has shifted. And that is so central. And Schaefer used to say the reason Christian parents can't talk to their own kids is because their own kids have absorbed a secular view of truth. It's not just the content of truth, the doctrines of Christianity, it's the concept of truth itself. And it's the main reason we have trouble communicating with secular people as well. And so total truth really delves into how has the concept of truth changed, and how as Christians, can we overcome that barrier, both with secular people, and our own kids. And then this was my first book.
I am not familiar with the soul of science. I'm going to need to read that too.
It was my first book. And
The Soul of Science, Christian Faith and Natural Philosophy. Mm-hmm.
Yes. And what I do in this book is show the interrelationship between Christianity and science from the time of the scientific revolution. And I for people who are kind of science phobic, which includes most of us, I put just enough science in to explain the philosophical implications. How did this change the Western worldview?
Absolutely.
So I start with showing how Christianity actually gave the foundations for modern science.
Absolutely, it did, unmistakably so. Mm-hmm.
For example, laws in nature. There's a non-Christian historian who puts it this way: there's no other culture, East or West, ancient or modern, that has ever talked about laws in connection to nature. It came strictly out of the Middle Ages, when Western culture was permeated with Christianity, and they believed that if God was a lawgiver morally, then he would be a lawgiver in terms of his creation as well. Mm-hmm, so this book is used a lot by homeschooling families, by the way, to teach science.
Yeah. I use an argument that I call the law of spiritual gravity. None of us would deny the law of gravity, even if we're not aware of it. As little children, we may not be able to articulate what it is, but we live under it. I mean, if you're going to fall, you're going to hurt yourself. I mean, gravity is going to take over, and you can't rebel against gravity. It's just I've never heard of anyone being French going on strike against gravity. You just don't do that. And no one would think of it. Well, what about the law of spiritual gravity, which with sin, it's and just saying it's relative just doesn't make sense. It doesn't make any more sense to say that the law of gravity is relative any more than the law of spiritual gravity is relative. They're just some set truth in the same way. So
yes, and now you that's total truth again. Because one of the things Schaefer showed is the concept in the Western culture, the concept of truth is split, so that people accept scientific truth, but moral and spiritual truth has been put into a different category. Absolutely. That's just a matter of personal opinion, personal preference, personal feelings. And most people don't realize that. He calls it the split view of truth. And he uses the metaphor of two stories in a building. So in the lowest story, we have reason and science, and that's considered something everyone is supposed to accept. And then morality, spiritual truths, and so on have been tossed into the upper story, where they're seen as purely subjective and private. And most Christians don't realize this. Here's how my students put it: when they finally get it, oh, this is a split mindset that most people have, and they don't know they have it. They say, this is the Matrix. This is the Matrix.
Absolutely. Yes. Oh, the Matrix is one of the most Christian themed movies ever. They got so much flack for it, actually, because people were accusing them of having a Christian agenda, which I don't think they did. But it's just, that's the way it is, because when you follow the laws of nature, you will, whether it's gravity or even Matrix, like good movie making, you will end up with some kind of Judeo-Christian sub-theme, because that's truth. You can't help it but land on truth eventually, somehow, one way or another.
We're made in God's image, and we have to live in God's world. And therefore, even non-Christians always have some truth in their art or in their literature, their philosophy, whatever. Yeah.
Oh, this is so fascinating. I love talking with you. This is a dream come true for me. I'm having so much fun right now. So you mentioned Francis Schaeffer's, his worldview, and I think you mention it in most of your books. And in The Toxic War on Masculinity is no exception. I think in the early parts, I've read through the entire thing, so I'm not exactly sure what chapter, but you definitely mentioned the history of in this case, how humanity came to view masculinity, quote unquote, as toxic. But you do appeal to these arguments, and I love that. So let's switch gears a little bit and start talking about this book. You say, there's a quote I picked up towards, I guess, halfway through your book, and in my humble opinion and experience of your books, I think it kind of sums up kind of everything we've talked about and setting the stage for the whole book. You say Christians should read with their worldview antenna poised in order to pick up underlying messages. And I love that because it's so essential. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think in the context there, I was talking about a genre of literature that was actually called literary naturalism. Mm-hmm. And it was very big here in the States, by the way, although there were some French writers as well. Émile Zola. Have you read Émile? So Émile Zola, it was considered the theorist of the literary naturalists. At any rate, these were literary people who were convinced of Darwinism. So here in the States, the best known is Jack London. But what meant, and most students read Jack London in high school sometime, but what they don't know is that Jack London had what one historian calls a conversion experience to radical materialism by reading the books of Darwin and Herbert Spencer too, who was a popularizer of Darwin. At any rate, he memorized passages from Darwin like Christians memorize scripture. So it truly was a religious commitment for him. And then when he wrote his books, like The Call of the Wild, they deal with animals like dogs, but he was intending them as a metaphor for humans. And so his worldview was that we're products of evolution. We're completely determined by genetics and environment. We have no free will, and we have no higher dignity or value than the animals. And a short story that I deal with in the book is called The Law of Life, and it's about an Eskimo tribe that leaves the aging grandfather to die in the snow as they move on. They're a nomadic tribe. So it's from the perspective of the grandfather who's left behind. And of course, it's devastating to be left behind by your family. But then he comforts himself by saying, well, isn't this the Darwinian law of life? That once you fulfill the reproductive imperative, passed on your genes to the next generation, then what value do you have? Your only value is biological. And so as the wolves come in to devour him, he thinks to himself, well, what is our purpose anyway? It's to pass on our genes, and then then our life has no more value. And is it not the law of life? And that's how the story ends. So that was an example of where I have had so many people read Jack London. Like, as a teacher, I've met people, as a homeschooler, and they never recognized the worldview. They never saw it. So that's why I'm saying we need to have our worldview antenna out. Even when we read so-called classic literature, we need to know what worldview is being expressed, because they're not just artists. I should say all artists are also thinkers. They are thinkers, and they are wrestling with the ideas of their day. And we need to make sure we understand that when we read their books.
Absolutely. I remember reading Jack London in French as a teenager. It was some of my dad was a very strong atheist. Sounds a bit similar to yours in some ways. And he was like, Jack London was one of his heroes, and he fed me Jack London for many years. And I didn't realize how much he was feeding my own atheism at the time, and just the whole 9 yards. So I completely agree with you. We don't understand. Like we were saying earlier, fish don't know what water is. We don't know what we're swimming in unless we're taken out of it. And that's the beauty of being taken out of our own cultures when we are American traveling to Europe or vice versa, because it suddenly exposes some of the things we've taken for granted, including the books we've read, the culture that has been indoctrinated into us. And in the Christian worldview, as you were saying, Romans 1 and everything, it's so freeing, so liberating, because it takes us out of our own water into other deeper waters that are so much more truthful, obviously, right? Speaking of Darwinism, it's kind of safe to say that scientific Darwinism is basically under fire today and largely revoked, but social Darwinism is still such a big thing. Do you want to tell us a little bit about some of the effects you see on it today in our culture, in our generation, and maybe even the challenges you see for our kids? what are they going to be up against in terms of social Darwinism still ruling the day?
To be honest, even though Darwinism is under fire today on the scientific level, if you have friends who are biologists, you know that it's still very much alive.
Very much, but they're kind of the last bastion, you know, because a lot of others have kind of moved on. But I hear you. Yes, it's still under fire, but I have hope they're losing that battle.
The scientific data, certainly is against sort of random mutations and natural selection. Mm-hmm. But social Darwinism, it's a broad question. So let me focus on this book, on masculinity.
Yes.
In this book, I deal with the history of the impact of Darwinism on our concepts of masculinity. And it was really quite stunning and quite troubling to read the Darwinist thinkers like Spencer. I mentioned he was the main popularizer here in America. So Herbert Spencer said, the men who win out, or historically who won out in the struggle for survival, were tough, mean, predatory, barbarian, savage. These are the ones who came out on top. And so these are our ancestors. And therefore, this is our true nature as men. This is men's true nature. And yes, there's a thin veneer of civilization. That was their favorite phrase. There's a thin veneer of civilization over it. But to be truly men, we need to get back in touch with the beast within. Ever since the ancient Greeks, people said, men should aspire to their higher nature, their spiritual and moral nature. And they should keep their physical animal appetites in control. And so this was a dramatic reversal when leading thinkers began to say, no, our true self is the animal instincts, the impulse for power and domination and winning the struggle for survival. And, this is our true nature. And civilization is something that holds us back. We really need to get back in touch with our inner animal. This is when books like Tarzan were very popular. Remember, he had about 50 books in the series. And the whole point was, because he was raised by apes, he was raised in the wild, he had not been subject to the
painted by civilization.
The debilitating impact of civilization. And so that's one reason those books were so popular. In fact, the son of the author said explicitly that we're trying to figure out what it means that we are part of the animal world, that we have no higher spiritual goal, but we're part of the animal world. And then you'll love this. So then you ask someone like Spencer, if men are naturally barbarians and savages and predators, how do women get along with them? And he said, well, it would help if they developed the ability to please. And then he added,
I'm shaking my head here.
This is not taught in your science classes on Darwinism. And then he added, it would also be good if they learned to hide their distress at bad treatment. So this is the message of Darwinism, apparently, is men are naturally savage and barbarian, and women need to hide their distress at being so poorly treated. And you wonder where this
and if you push that, the logic is the women who survived, or ancestors, are the ones who learned those traits. Therefore, women would technically be inferior if you follow the logic, both intellectually, well, in terms of physical strength, that's a fact, but like all of the other, they would not be intellectually able to resist that, because by definition, only the weak ones would be the stronger ones in that case, because they would be the ones who survive. And so it promotes pretty strong anti-women views, which, if I may, sound like some very fundamentalist conservative views some days, don't they?
Well, I deal with it in explaining where the concept of toxic, that masculinity is toxic. Yes, the impact of Darwinism contributed greatly to a very toxic concept of masculinity. And by the way, I quote Darwin himself too, because Darwin did explicitly say that women are inferior to men, explicitly, that they're not as intelligent, that he acknowledged, this was so funny, he acknowledged that they're more sensitive and more intuitive, but then he said, oh, but those are traits of the lower animals, so even what we're good at, showed that we are inferior. So Darwinism definitely contributed to the notion that men are toxic. And your point about fundamentalism, let me put it this way. Well, men who are not thoroughly grounded in the scripture will pick up on the secular definition. So it's not that they're getting it from scripture, which is what critics would say, right? Critics of Christianity would say that Christian notions of masculinity, lead to patriarchy and dominance and power and so on. No, the ones who are actually the most toxic in the Christian world, and we can talk about the actual sociological data showing this, are more nominal Christian men who are picking up their concepts of masculinity from the secular world, which is one reason we need to know what the secular world is saying. We need to know the impact of Darwinism because it seeps into the church.
Absolutely. Yes. There's so many ways this could go. I mean, I've read your book and there's just so much I would want to talk about. And so one thing you said, it's very interesting. This Darwinist idea that men are, savages and the real man has to be an outdoors wild person who is in touch with his inner brutality and absolutely not with civilization in any way, shape or form. And saying that almost that's the traditional model, quote unquote, and I'm using the word traditional very loosely because that's really not going back in history far enough. That's only going back a couple hundred years as opposed to much more than that. As you were saying, I love the comparison you make with the Greek the Greek aspirations for the higher ideals of the intellect and the heart, as opposed to just sheer force and brutality. And that is something you do so well. I've seen you do it, I think, in most of your books, of looking at history and helping us, 21st century Christians reframe our faith in the context and our interpretation of of what we see around us in the context of thousands of years in history, not just the last 100 years or so. So thank you, by the way, for that. That is so important. History helps us understand where we're really truly coming from. So thank you for that.
Oh yeah, and the idea of brutality, that men are naturally brutal, lewd, rude, and crude, is 19th century. It's not even that far back. It's 19th century. There was a reaction against the Industrial Revolution. And men began to feel as if they were being, the word was over-civilized. As men no longer worked in the field and went hunting and, no longer worked outside and worked in offices and factories, there was a concern that we were losing the male spirit. And so that it was really mid to late 19th century even that you see this reaction of men saying, oh, well, we've got to get back in touch with our inner barbarian. So it's very recent, actually. And Christian books that are picking up on this theme, that we're naturally wild and uncivilized, and we need to get back to that. They're just baptizing late 19th century secular thought.
Yeah, yeah. And it's interesting because, and you do a great job in the book where you address how Christian ministers would preach from the pulpit those ideas that, because they were being indoctrinated with the secular ideas. And now we pick up and we read those books that they wrote 100 years ago, and we think that that's how Christians always thought, but it's not. They were being infected, quote unquote, by secular ideas that were influencing their preaching. And now we think it's almost canonical, whereas these were radical new ideas. And I love how you walk us through history and specifically the interactions between men and women, because that's the topic of your book here. And how before the Industrial Revolution, men and women were really equal in their task and their contribution to society and to family. And then the Industrial Revolution changed all of that, with the women being put on a pedestal sometimes or being put in the gutter at other seasons, like kind of maybe right now a bit more. And then men having the same, the counterbalance on that, and the role with Darwinism and all of that. So you're basically helping us understand why we are where we are today, where toxic masculinity as a concept comes from, and how it's really not biblical at all. So, as I mean, this could continue. I really just love your book truly so much. But can you walk us briefly through? You talk a lot in the second half of the book about fatherhood, the importance of fatherhood, and how you present that as one of the solutions for reintegration of the man and woman relationship in a healthier way, in a Christian way. Do you want to tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, the long-term solution to toxic behavior in men is better fathers. I quote a psychiatrist who said, we're not going to have a better class of men until we have a better class of fathers, because the father-son relationship is just so crucial to men growing up with a healthy masculinity. And right now in the States, I don't know if you realize this, but 40% of children are growing up apart from their natural fathers. We have the highest rate of single parenthood in the world. And
it's
so
tragic.
We have a whole generation of young men who are growing up not without a good, healthy, loving role model in the home. And we all know that fathers are ridiculed and mocked in the media, right? They're treated as the dimwit dad, the doofus dad, the butt of the joke. And so, no wonder men have less motivation to become fathers. And even that goes back to the Industrial Revolution. Again, people know that men are mocked, but they don't know why. It turns out that before the Industrial Revolution, fathers worked with their kids all day. They worked on the farm or the family industry or the family shop. And so they were working alongside their children throughout the day, teaching them in adult skills. And of course, husband and wife were working side by side as well. So as you put it earlier, so there's a kind of practical equality between them. Everyone knows they're both economically indispensable. The Industrial Revolution changes all that because it takes work out of the home. And fathers had to follow their work out of the home into factories and offices. It disrupted the male-female relationship. It also disrupted the father-child relationship because fathers were no longer home all day. They no longer knew what their kids were doing all day. They no longer were tuned into their kids' needs, their kids' personalities. And already in the 19th century, you see books starting to denigrate fathers as being irrelevant and incompetent as parents because they simply were not there. And you see a lot of literature decrying the loss of fatherhood already back in the 19th century. And so, if they were out of touch with the family, they started being portrayed as sort of incompetent bumblers. And that's the source of that. So again, the solution to that is to get fathers more involved with their kids. And I do have a whole chapter on sort of practical solutions, ways that we can maybe tweak the workplace to allow men to work at home more. The pandemic, the one silver lining on the pandemic is a lot of fathers discovered they liked working at home. 65% in one survey said they did not want to work full-time again in the office, away from home full-time anymore. And the New York Times had an article just recently, so it's not in the book, it just came out. But it said, during the pandemic, many fathers got closer to their children and they don't want to lose that. And I thought, yes, right now it's more anecdotal. I tell stories of lots of people who found ways to work from home. And I'll just give you one of them. So I had one student whose husband was a IT professional during the pandemic. He comes home. He's more involved with the homeschooling. He decides he'll be the one who makes lunch every day. He's there now to take his kids to soccer. His wife is freed up enough that she starts a part-time business. She's an opera singer. I had a student who's an opera singer.
Wow.
So she starts a voice studio and the whole family benefits from the added income. And I interviewed the husband and he said, our family's somewhat to a balance now. I am never going back to a cubicle. And then the final kicker is he said, the time that he used to spend commuting, he now spends praying with his wife every morning. So I give lots of anecdotes like that just to inspire people that there are ways to make the workplace more flexible. And millennials, surveys show that millennials really want this. They're really asking, both men and women both want more balance. They want some time in the workplace and more time at home. But women want more time developing their skills and their talents as well. Both sides want more balance. Unfortunately, our industrial work situation is not set up for that. But if you push for it, you can find alternatives.
Yeah, that's one of the many things you do so well, is that you alternate personal anecdotes of people you've interviewed, you really know. So you you spice up your book all the way, with all sorts of personal stories. And so that makes it really relatable and real. But then there's also so much research, so many statistics, so many surveys and articles that you reference. I mean, the notes section on your book is like an inch thick, right? Because there's so many sources, and that's wonderful. And then you bring your own perspective and theology into it. So it's just this trifecta of very convincing elements that you bring to the table. And so, you were hinting that probably one of the things that men lost most at the Industrial Revolution and beyond was their relationship with their children. And that at the same time, women lost a lot as well. What would you say women lost as a result of the husbands having to go out to work eventually, like the bottom, and that now maybe the pandemic is helping us regain again?
Yeah, there have actually been some articles on how women too have appreciated being home more during the pandemic and having more time with their kids. And I should tell you that Total Truth has a whole chapter on especially its effect on women. So I do it only briefly here because this is a book on men. But it's true that when work was done in the home, the family industry, the family farm, men and women shared pretty equally in economic productivity. And women's self-esteem was greatly enhanced by the fact that they knew they were economically indispensable. And it was enhanced by the fact that they had a lot of interesting work to do. They could do it while raising their kids. And fathers could raise their kids while working. And the Industrial Revolution took all that interesting and creative work out of the home. And from the very obvious things, from canning fruit and making butter, baking bread, making candles, weaving your own cloth and sewing your own clothes, making your own medicine with herbal concoctions. Women were huge contributors to the family economy. And that was all taken away from them when work was removed from the home. And it did cause a huge crisis in women's sense of purpose and meaning. Like, okay, well, what do we do now? I mean, we're stuck with house cleaning and early childcare. I mean, it's just not enough. And it is a main reason for the rise of the feminist movement. And so even though I don't agree with all their solutions, I understand why it happened, that women also lost a huge amount of social status and personal self-esteem when they lost their economically productive contribution to the household and became economically dependent on the wages of their husbands. That was also something that undercut their self-esteem. Instead of being an equal partner, they were now economically dependent on a wage earner. It altered the power dynamics in the home. If the woman was no longer contributing anything very much that was seen as valuable, then they didn't have as much of a voice. People didn't feel like, well, why should we pay attention to you? They lost their moral status in the home as well. And so when we, if we're critical of feminism, we need to also look at, well, why did it happen? And is there a solution to this that's more biblical? And of course, the solution is pretty much the same. Can you recover some of that economic productivity? And of course, many women do. Most women I know who are home with kids also have part-time jobs from the home so that they can integrate it with their child rearing, integrate it with raising kids. I did that for most of my career. I realize it's easier if you're a writer. Some professions are easier than others. But I did a lot of research and writing and editing sitting in my car office while my kid was volunteering at the nature center. He was very into animals. So he volunteered at the nature center 3 days a week. Or sometimes homeschooling classes, the rest of the family's out in the car doing their homeschooling, or for me, it was doing my work. I'd be editing a book beside the soccer field. People say, oh, what are you doing? I'm editing a book. What? They didn't expect that answer.
Yeah. And now men get to experience that too, and to work from the soccer bleachers and other such places. It's interesting how you kind of explain that working less actually leads to more productivity. And it's interesting because as and how really the solution isn't to kill yourself with overwork and working on weekends and late nights, and it actually kills productivity, not to mention creativity, because burnout and exhaustion are never conducive to creativity. It's interesting, in France, you might be familiar with the fact that legally the week has gone from 40 to 35 hours several years ago, and there, as far as I I hear, I mean, I'm not on top of the latest statistics, but it has not impacted productivity. And so now legally you work 35 hours a week, which I remember the Americans decrying the French and saying, oh my goodness, the French are so lazy, which I'm like, yeah, maybe we are, but actually, you know, it's working and it gives us more time. And anything above 35 hours is overwork. And you get paid additional hours, or you get more vacation time. We joked, my husband and I, when we lived in France and the 35 hours went in practice, because we were considered kind of a little higher up in the management of the companies, they couldn't force us to only do 35 hours. It wasn't realistic. So you would take more paid vacation time. And so we would end up, most of the kind of higher ups in any company would end up with anywhere from 7 to 9 weeks of vacation every year. That's how it worked. And it works really well. And productivity has not tanked, and France has not gone bankrupt, and families are actually healthier as a result of that. And it's interesting, coming from one of the most atheist secular countries, that these are actually some of the solutions that might work in America today.
Yes, I was stunned when I researched that. I didn't hit France, but I hit some other countries that tried reduced work hours. And they did not lose productivity, and work-life balance went up. People were happier. They were actually more productive. Same thing with the pandemic, by the way. I quote a CEO who said, you know, we never wanted to allow workers to work from home because we thought they'd slough off, you know, they'd goof off. And they said the pandemic completely exploded that. Not only do they keep up the same level of work, but actually they often work too much, you know, because they don't have to commute, they don't have to dress up, you know, they're saving a lot of time, which they then give to the company. So if anything, the problem with work from home is that they tend to overwork, they never leave, which I can say.
I can relate to that. Yes, I've never worked so hard as since I've been working from home.
Yeah, me too. And I actually took that to heart when I read every hour you work over 40. That was the study I found. Every hour you work over 40, you're actually getting less productive. That really hit me because I always work more than that. And let me bring it back to maybe the sociological studies. Mm-hmm. Did you have a question on that you wanted to bring up?
No, go ahead.
Because one of the things that's contributed so much to a secular script for masculinity. Well, I'll start with the sociological study that I put in the front of the book. This has proved to be the most controversial book I've ever written, and that surprised me. I didn't expect that. I thought Love Thy Body would be.
Love Thy Body. I know that would have been my guess too.
But at least in the Christian world, I guess theologically conservative Christians really do pretty much agree on homosexuality, transgenders, and abortion. And I was just giving them more tools, more worldview tools to explain it, you know, to teach the kids better, to address the secular world better. But in the Christian world, the male-female issues are actually more inflammatory. So in my classes, for example, most of my young female students identify as feminists. And if I said anything positive about men, they would get triggered. You know, if I said men are strong, they would say, well, women are strong too. Of course, yes, but this is a book on men. Or when I announced to my class I was writing a book on masculinity, a male student immediately shot back, what masculinity? It's been beaten out of us. So I had to rewrite the first chapter multiple times. And when people talked about the book, you know, to their friends and family members, invariably the first question would be, whose side is she on? You know, it's immediate, this hostile reaction. Whose side is she on? And why is a woman writing a book on masculinity anyway? So one of the things that I found that was helpful is I started the book with this sociological study. The guy's not a Christian, but he's very well known in his field. And so he gets invited to speak all around the world. And he has devised 2 questions that he asks young men, you know, from Australia to France to Ecuador. He asks them 2 questions. He says, what does it mean to be a good man? You know, if you had a funeral and the eulogy is he was a good man, what does that mean? And they have no problem answering that. They say, in fact, let me see if I can, here's my notes, so I can give you the exact words. Honor, duty, integrity, sacrifice, do the right thing, stand up for the little guy. I kind of like that one. Be a provider, be a protector, be responsible. And the sociologists would say, well, where'd you get that? And they say, well, it's just in the air we breathe. And especially in the Western countries, they would say it's our Judeo-Christian heritage. Then he would say, okay, second question. What if I say to you, man up, be a real man? The young men said, no, that's completely different. That's not the same at all. And they said, that means be tough, be strong, never show weakness, win at all costs, suck it up, be competitive, get rich, get laid. That's why I had to read it. That's not my words.
No, yeah.
Get rich, get laid. And so that the difference between the good man and the real man. Men are made in God's image, and they do know what it means to be a good man, universally, around the world. In fact, there's another study done by an anthropologist, is the first cross-cultural study of concepts of masculinity a couple of years ago. And he found that no matter what their view of masculinity was, they agreed on what he called the 3 Ps: provide, protect, and procreate, contribute to the next generation. So men do know what it means to be the good man, but their culture, especially the more secularized the culture gets, the more it pressures them to be the real man, defined by the things that we normally mean by toxic, by, look out for number one, get ahead, be aggressive.
Being a predator. Yeah. Being a predator in every sense of the word, not just sexually, but a predator everywhere.
Yes. And so I kind of use this as a connecting thread through the whole book.
Yeah.
Like, as I said, where do we get our concept of the good man? Well, since I limit it to America, one reason I did that, by the way, is because it meant I could start with a Christian view, because early America was pretty much Christian. And so it gave an easy way to set a baseline of the Christian perspective. And then to show as modern culture secularized, how we lost that, and how the real man, as we talked about earlier, the Darwinian influence, for example, how the real man took over, and how when people talk about masculinity being toxic, they're referring to the real man that puts so much pressure on men to live up to a different standard, not the good man, but the real man.
And it all makes sense, because that real man, quote unquote, has Darwinian origins. And again, if mankind is only the most evolved of all animals, and then, yes, if survival of the fittest is the rule, then it would make sense that the real man, quote unquote, in the toxic form you just described, is considered the epitome of manhood. It all connects and makes sense. It's just completely flawed.
Yes, and I also want to go back to another thing that you said earlier and flesh it out a little more. You talked about fundamentalism having sometimes...
Yes, I wanted to ask you about that, like the response of the church to all of this. So let's maybe end with that, with, how you are doing such a great job explaining to us, helping us remember or see for the first time what the response of the church has been ever since the Industrial Revolution, and especially today.
Yeah, so, well, first of all, critics of Christianity typically say it's Christianity that holds women down, that at least to an oppressive patriarchy. Let me see if I can find you some quotes. It was very easy to find quotes on this. Where'd it go?
And as you're looking for your quotes, I'm going to share maybe with my audience a couple of the things that I really took home that I didn't know, not being American. So I'm still discovering a lot about the American culture, and I love it. For example, I didn't realize that the YMCA was created as part of a Christian response, quote unquote, at the time to in the late 1800s. And it was very interesting to hear how you're describing the birth of the YMCA. And I had always wondered what it had to do with Christian men, the C in Christian. I was like, okay, what on earth is that? So you explained that for me. I'm grateful for that. And I invite our listeners to read just to discover that. And then also I found it fascinating to discover that the Moody Bible Institute initially enrolled women in pastor courses until the early 1900s, and then stopped because it just wasn't appropriate anymore to have women pastors in the culture, and that half of their classes were initially women, and then they completely changed gears and started offering more traditional quote unquote women sewing and knitting and cooking classes and whatever, as opposed to in-depth theological classes to become a pastor. I found that so illustrative of how Christians or the church approached that whole issue with fundamentalism as it was being born in the 1900s. So that were two examples I took home as being very enlightening.
Good. Yes. Well, and today, partly because of that, it's very easy to find criticisms of conservative Christian churches. And I'll read you just a few that I found very quickly online. Conservative Protestant gender ideology can clearly lead to abuse, both physical and emotional. Another one, it's no secret that abuse is prevalent in conservative churches that embrace headship theory. Another one, the theology of male headship feeds the rape culture that we see permeating American Christianity today. The answer to this is it ignores the data from the social sciences. It turns out that social scientists have said, well, where's the evidence? You're making these claims, but where's the evidence? So for the last couple of decades, sociologists have been going back and actually doing studies of Christian couples. And what they have found is that evangelical family men, married with kids, who attend church regularly are actually the most loving husbands and the most engaged fathers. Compared to the average American family man, evangelical men are the most loving to their wives. And yes, they did interview the wives separately. That's important. So
yes,
actually what they're saying is the wives report being the happiest with the quality of love and affection that they get from their husbands. The evangelical men are the most engaged fathers, both in terms of shared activities like sports and church youth group, and also discipline, like limiting screen time, setting bedtime. Evangelical couples are the least likely to divorce, and they have, this is a real surprise, they have the lowest rate of domestic violence of any major group in America. So there's by the way, and this was one of the main reasons I wrote the book, by the way, because this information is not out there in the public yet. Yeah. I had to go back and pull out the sociological academic journals to get this data. And I said, we need to know this. Christians don't know this. Christian men don't know how well they're doing because they're constantly being criticized and jumped on. And so my favorite, my go-to sociologist, he did the largest study. His name is Brad Wilcox at the University of Virginia. And he wrote an article in the New York Times in which he said, it turns out that the happiest of all wives in America, they are talking especially about the wives, because supposedly the evangelical men are abusive to their wives. The happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives. Fully 73% of wives who hold conservative gender values and attend religious services regularly with their husbands have high quality marriages. I was stunned that the New York Times printed this, first of all, but that shows the status that this particular sociologist has. He's considered like the best marriage researcher in America. He's a conservative Catholic, by the way. But Christians don't know this. And it's really interesting to hear Brad Wilcox talking to his secular colleagues, because those are the main people he interacts with, and they're like, well, why does church have so much influence? Why would this make a difference? And he said, well, let's face that the church is one of the few institutions in the United States where men encounter other men who are interested in talking about fatherhood and marriage, and interested in practicing what they hear preached. You don't find it at work. You don't find it at the sports stadium. You don't find it in the local tavern. But in church, what you will find is a message and an ethos that's family focused and gives men the motivation to attend to their families. And then my favorite line at the end of that, he concludes, academics need to cast aside their prejudices about religious conservatives and about evangelicals in particular. that conservative Protestant married men with children are consistently the most active and expressive fathers and the most emotionally engaged husbands. So this is our answer. I mean, the Christian world has an answer to toxic behavior in men. And that, if you don't read any of the rest of the book, read the first couple of chapters so that you can get this message out there. And, you know, speaking to someone who's international, I wanted to make sure I also included that sociologists, is more like anthropologists. Anthropologists have found this to be the same everywhere Christianity goes. So let me give you a few of those findings. One anthropologist just went to Colombia, and she was a Marxist. So she was convinced that she was going to find that, you know, evangelicalism makes men overbearing patriarchs, and she was stunned. She found the opposite. She said, you know, in Latin America, the machismo culture tells a man he's a real man if he's out there drinking and smoking and gambling and visiting prostitutes. And it's Christianity that reconnects men to their families, brings their money home, and so the entire family experiences a higher standard of living. And she says, if there's a women's movement in Latin America, it's evangelical Christianity. Mm-hmm. And there was a much larger study done by a sociologist at the University of London. So she included not only Latin America, but Africa and Asia. And she says the same thing. She too found that women supported by the church, she brings in the church, by the way, supported by the church, women have more power in their marriages to, here's what she says, the church helps men put the needs of the household above their own pleasure, gets rid of the double standard, and improves women's living conditions. She said it's not the secular aid societies, it's not the feminist groups, it's those quote unquote backward, unsophisticated evangelicals who actually believe the Bible, who have been the most successful in bringing men, reconnecting men to their family, and he says it has functioned as a very effective women's movement. And I'm going to give you one more example, because this is the best-selling book, and it's not even by a Christian. It's by a New York Times columnist, of all things. And his book is called Half the Sky. So if you want to see a secular approach to it, this is a very good book. And he says, in developing countries, the evangelical church applies pressure to bring wayward husbands back in line. And he says specifically to hold men accountable for alcoholism and adultery, which he says cause enormous pain to women, especially in Africa. Mm-hmm. The point is that this has really shocked the secular anthropologists and sociologists, because one of the books on it is actually called The Evangelical Gender Paradox, because to them, they really expected Christianity to lead men to be more abusive and controlling and domineering. And it has not had that impact. Once they go out and collect the real data, you know, like I said earlier, when they cast aside their prejudices and looked at the facts, they're finding that all around the globe, Christianity actually helps men to be more connected to their families, more loving, and the women experience a higher quality of living.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating that the secular researchers would call that a paradox. Fascinating indeed. You and I know better than to call it a paradox, but indeed it's but it takes a lot of courage for them to go out and start saying that. And so the fact that you're putting this out there for the Christian community to hear, because this is, as you said, this is not something Christians hear a whole lot. We do hear the statistics that divorce is the same, you know, across whatever your worldview is, including the Christian worldview. So it's interesting how you say you do separate truly believing Christian men as opposed to the nominal Christians who are not faring any better and probably even worse than the general population. So there's you're talking here about people, men and women, who are truly devoted to Christ and are truly his followers, because the nominal ones, that's not the same picture at all. And thus the paradox.
Well, that's true. Well, and that's why the statistics are often misleading, because we do hear that Christians divorce at the same rate. In fact, in my research, I found that's one of the most frequently cited statistics by Christian leaders. Apparently they're trying to motivate us, negatively. But so the researchers went back to the data and they did what you just said. They divided out the truly committed, authentically committed Christian men from the nominal Christian men. By the way, I have to tell my students don't even know what nominal means. It means in name only. N-O-M is Latin for name.
It's the French, nom, actually. N-O-M is the French for name as well. So that's an easy one for me. Yeah.
And so they, what they did is they separated out men who might, on one of these surveys, they might check the Baptist box, but they actually don't attend church regularly, if at all. And these men are shockingly different. They do fit all the toxic stereotypes. They're the least loving with their wives. They're the least engaged with their kids. They have the highest level of divorce, higher than secular men. And they have the highest rate of domestic violence of any group in America, higher than secular men. So this is devastating. If you put these two groups together, the authentic men, Christian men who are better than secular men by far, but you put them together with the nominal who are worse than secular men. And if you simply do, what are evangelicals like? You'll get this misleading statistic.
It's a wash. Yeah.
That's one reason people don't know how well truly committed men are doing, because most of the studies just say, okay, evangelicals, or even worse, just Christians. So it also shows you what we're up against in the church, because the church then is having to deal with men who may be hanging around the fringes of the Christian world. And maybe one reason they're even worse than secular men is that they do pick up the language of headship and submission, but they infuse it with secular meaning, which makes it even more toxic than a purely secular person.
Right, because all of a sudden they're a real man, quote unquote, in the toxic sense, but on steroids.
Yeah,
because they have the permission of the church, quote unquote, to do all of this toxic behavior, because all of a sudden they think it's sanctified by the church, and the woman in the marriage or the kids in the relationship are left hanging.
Yes, exactly. And by the way, I do have at the end of the book, I have 2 chapters on abuse in Christian families, because as long as that many men, the number of nominal men, by the way, is roughly equal to the number of committed men. I when I first read it, I thought, well, this is a smaller group, right? Because you and I probably hang out mostly with committed Christians. So no, in one study, they're at least the same size. So you have a 50-50 chance when you meet somebody who claims to be a Christian that they're real Christian or they're just a cultural Christian, who claims an evangelical identity because of their family and their cultural background. But like you say, have infused it with secular ideas. So the church now has a responsibility, I would say, not only to get the positive message out, but also to reach out to these men who are claiming an evangelical identity, but who do not, in fact, live it out at all.
Yeah. Wow, this is so good. We could keep going. I want to be respectful of your time, so we're going to wrap it up a little bit. If this has not led our audience to want to read your book, because it just has so much information, as we wrap up, who would you say should read this book? Who have you written this book for?
Oh, well, all of my books, I write on a very accessible level, because I don't want it to be read just by academics.
Thank you for that, by the way.
By the way, there's even, you may not know this, but there's even there's a tool that educators use to make sure that their books on the right grade level. And on the internet, you can throw your manuscript in and it'll tell you what grade level it is. So ever since I discovered that, I worked very hard to make it at least 9th or 10th grade level.
Yeah, not too much, lingo, not too much, academic lingo for those of us who cannot read those words.
Yeah, but I really do. I make a point of it, because even though, like you said, it's very well documented, it's very data driven. This is probably the most factual book I've written, because I have the facts of sociology showing what a good job Christian men are doing. And then I have the facts of history showing how we lost that historically. Where did the concept of toxicity even come from? Because that's what we're up against in the secular world, and in the Christian world. So it's very fact-based, but it's very accessible. And I like the way you pointed out earlier that my books have lots of stories, especially since starting. I've been teaching for the past 10 years. And so I have lots of student stories. One of my students said this, and one of my students said that. Lots of personal anecdotes, because you're right, that really brings it to life. So yeah, I would hope that, and that people on both sides, like I said, it's the most controversial book I've written, because I've had some very conservative people read it and react one way, and then I've had some friends who are very progressive, progressive Christians, who tore it apart. And I'm very hopeful that both sides, I had to almost plead with my audience, look, can't we be objective? Can't we, as Christians, we're in the world, but not of it. We should be able to rise above that kind of polarization and just look at what does Scripture teach, and what do we learn from history about our secular culture? Can we just look at the facts objectively, from a Christian point of view? So I'm hoping nobody will say, oh, well, she's on one side, or no, she's on the other side. No, I'm trying to speak to all real Christians and give them a biblical perspective.
Yeah. Picking sides is a very American pastime. So, I'm just so grateful for this time you've given us today, and I hope we will hear back from our audience what they have learned from your book. So, Nancy Pearcey, thank you so much for being with us today on the Gospel Spice podcast.
Oh, thank you so much for asking me, and I like your spice metaphor. Is great. I love it.
You're so kind. Thank you.
And now, a brief message from Gospel Spice.
Do you find yourself reading your Bible, going to church, doing all the right things, and yet somehow you still crave a deeper, more down-to-earth connection with God and with other people? Maybe you're just tired of organized Christianity, but you still long for that refreshing taste of the simple but profound truth and goodness found in God's Word. Hello, my name is Faith, and I'm a pastor's wife and women's ministry leader at my local church. And last September, I had the great privilege of hosting Stephanie and the Gospel Spice team for a 2-day conference at my church. During that time, they offered up an incredible feast of practical biblical truth and genuine love and concern for each person who attended. So if your church or women's ministry is in need of spiritual pick-me-up, I highly recommend that you schedule Stephanie and the team for a speaking engagement or a conference. And I promise you that Stephanie won't just tell you about her own experience with God, but she'll lead you to taste and see for yourself that the Lord is good.
Now, back to the video.
Thank you so much for watching today's episode. Merci. Please be sure to subscribe to our channel and click that bell icon so you are the first to know when we release a new video or episode. Also, would you please consider helping us reach new people with the good news of the spice of the gospel by leaving a 5-star review for the Gospel Spice podcast on listening platforms like Spotify, iTunes, Google, etc. Finally, share and follow us on social media to spread the word of Gospel Spice. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to tune in our podcast with new episodes every Friday. I'll see you in our next video very soon, right here. Merci.